In 1994, on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, excavators brushed soil from a T-shaped pillar standing over 5 meters tall and weighing by later estimate near 16 tons. It had been carved without metal tools and decorated along its surface with the low relief of a fox in mid-stride. The site would later be dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, more than 7,000 years before the first recognized cities appeared anywhere on Earth. No permanent houses stood nearby, no grain storage, no sign of the settled population we typically associate with that scale of organized labor. What the builders left was the pillar, and the question of what chapter of human experience had to exist in order to produce it. Tonight we follow that question not to answer it, but to trace its outline. We will move through 3 layers of evidence that keep surfacing quietly in the record of the stone tools that appear already accomplished, the agricultural knowledge that seems to arrive without rehearsal, and the memories preserved in ancient alignment and story that hold the shape of something older without naming what it was. 3 traces through the missing chapter between prehistory and civilization. We will not reach the far edge of that chapter tonight. That edge may not be reachable, but we can begin to read what remains of its margins. The human timeline is long, longer perhaps than we allow ourselves to sit with comfortably. Anatomically modern humans have existed for at least 300,000 years. That number is worth holding for a moment before moving past it. 300,000 years of fully modern minds, hands capable of precise work language, complex enough to teach and remember and grieve. 300,000 years, and what we call civilization occupies only the last 12,000 of them. That is roughly 4% of our existence as a species. 4% during which writing was invented, cities were built. Agriculture was formalized, and monumental architecture was raised at scales that still resist easy explanation. The question most timelines quietly pass over is not why civilization eventually appeared. Given what we now understand about human cognitive capacity, that outcome seems plausible enough. The question that lingers, the one the evidence keeps reopening, is why it appeared so completely so quickly, and with so few visible signs of the long preparation that complex systems almost always leave behind. Consider obsidian, a volcanic glass, dark and brittle, capable of producing an edge sharper than surgical steel, but only if worked with extraordinary restraint. Too much force and it shatters. Too little and nothing separates. Prehistoric toolmakers sourced obsidian from specific volcanic outcrops and transported it in some documented cases over distances of 300 kilometers or more. The finished tools found at these distant sites show clean controlled edges, the product of technique refined across years of practice, not improvised in a single attempt. What we do not find in the record surrounding these tools is the long visible learning curve that should have produced them. The skill is already present, already mature when it first becomes visible to us. The apprenticeship, the teaching, the broken pieces, the correction left almost nothing behind. This pattern is not unique to stone. It appears in agriculture and monument construction, in the earliest writing systems, in astronomical alignments precise enough to require generations of patient skywatching before a single stone was placed. Again and again, the product is present. The process is absent. Or rather, the process existed, but informs that time has been exceptionally good at erasing. Most of what humans do before civilization was carried in bodies and voices, rather than stored in external systems. A technique passed from elder to apprentice disappears when the line breaks. Entire bodies of ecological knowledge which plants held moisture through a dry season, which stars mark the moment to move camp, which soils would hold a root through frost, could dissolve within a generation if conditions turned severe enough. And conditions during the long stretch between the last glacial maximum and the first cities turned severe repeatedly. Sea levels rose more than 100 meters over several thousand years, swallowing coastlines where human populations had likely been densest. The Younger Dryas. A sudden return to near glacial cold beginning around 12,800 years ago interrupted what may have been early experiments in settlement and cultivation, dispersing whatever fragile systems had begun to cohere. Catastrophe does not need to kill everyone to erase knowledge. It only needs to break the transmission. What we are left with, when the record is examined carefully, is not so much a gap as a mismatch between how humans lived and how evidence survives, between what was known and what was stored in forms durable enough to outlast the knowing. Some researchers argue that this mismatch is largely a problem of preservation bias, that the visible record will eventually fill in as new sites are excavated and submerged coastlines are explored. That argument deserves weight, but it does not fully dissolve the observation that early civilization in multiple regions appears already organized, already confident, already operating with conventions that seem to require more preparation than the preceding record comfortably supports. The three traces we'll follow tonight do not resolve that mismatch. They describe it from different angles. The first runs through the stone, through tools that arrive already skilled, already consistent, already embedded in traditions whose origins we cannot locate. The second moves through the agricultural record, through crops that appear domesticated without a visible practice run, and through the ecological knowledge that may have preceded them by thousands of years in forms we can barely detect. The third follows what memory did when material traces failed of the flood stories the teacher figures the sense preserved across cultures that the world we inhabit is not quite the first version of itself. None of these traces will close into a conclusion tonight, so we begin with the stone, the weight of 300,000 years. A child born today will live, if fortune holds, somewhere between 80 and 90 years. In that span, the world will change considerably. Technologies will arrive that her grandparents could not have imagined. Languages will shift, cities will expand or quietly contract. The accumulated knowledge of her lifetime will be real and dense and layered, with the kind of detail that only direct experience produces. And yet in the absence of external records, almost all of it will be gone within 2 or 3 generations of her death. Not because it lacked value, but because that is simply what time does to knowledge stored only in people. It travels as far as the living can carry it and no further. Now hold that scale for a moment and then release it entirely, because the scale we are working with tonight is different by an order that resists easy comprehension. 300,000 years. Not 300, not 3,000, 300,000 years of anatomically modern human beings moving through the world. People with the same neural architecture we carry now, the same capacity for abstraction and language and long-range planning, the same ability to grieve and to teach and to wonder about what lies beyond the next ridge or the next season. 300,000 years of that, and what we call civilization, the cities, the agricultural systems, the written languages, the astronomical records, the monumental architecture, occupies only the final 4% of that span, roughly 12,000 years out of 300,000. A narrow ledge at the very end of a very long corridor. What occupied the rest of that corridor is the subject this episode traces. And the reason it remains worth tracing is not simply that the period is long or that it is poorly understood, but that in the places where the record speaks at all, in the tools, in the alignments, in the genetic signatures of early domesticated crops, in the structural consistency of monuments built before agriculture existed, what it says does not quite match the story the standard timeline tells. The story says slow accumulation, gradual refinement, steady progress toward complexity. The record says competence present at first visibility or at worst largely absent sophistication arriving without a legible childhood. These two things are not easily reconciled, and the tension between them is the gap this episode is about. The conventional account of human prehistory is not wrong in its broad outline. Humans lived as mobile foragers for most of their existence. The climate stabilized after the last ice age roughly 12,000 years ago. People began settling. Farming gradually took hold. Surplus production freed some members of growing communities from food acquisition, allowing specialization. Specialists produced new tools, new institutions, new ways of organizing social life. Cities emerged. Writing appeared to manage the administrative complexity that followed. Civilization in the form we recognize it began. The chain is logical, is supported by substantial evidence. But when you press on specific links, when you ask not where civilization ended up, but where its component parts came from and how long those parts demonstrably took to develop, the chain develops gaps that do not close under close examination. Agriculture offers the clearest example. In multiple regions across the world, domesticated crops appear in the archaeological record already bearing the genetic markers of sustained selective pressure. Larger seeds, thinner husks, altered dispersal mechanisms, traits that require not a single generation of observation, but hundreds of seasons of intentional management and careful selection. The wild ancestors of these plants are known. The final domesticated forms are known. But the long middle passage, the centuries of incremental experiment and failure and correction that should logically connect one to the other, exists in the record only in fragments and not always in the geographical sequences we would predict. Something in the developmental story is either missing from the ground or was conducted in conditions that left almost no durable trace. Monument construction shows a related compression. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, predating the first cities by more than 7,000 years, were not built by people learning tentatively how to coordinate large collective projects. They were built with a consistency that implies the coordination was already understood, already practiced, already carried within a shared tradition of some durability. The T-shaped pillars, some exceeding 5 meters in height and approaching 16 tons in weight, were quarried and shaped and raised with a precision that does not read as early experiment. The symbolic vocabulary carved along their surfaces, foxes, snakes, birds, abstract forms, repeats across multiple enclosures with enough regularity to suggest not improvisation, but a coherent visual language, one that someone had to have maintained across considerable time before the first stone was set into its socket. Writing, when it finally appears in the record, does not begin with clumsy approximations slowly refining into functional systems. It begins as administration list tallies, records of grain and labour and ownership already capable of encoding complex information with enough reliability to be used as legal and economic instruments. The people who produced the earliest known tablets were not fumbling toward literacy. They were using it for purposes that presuppose a social infrastructure already sophisticated enough to require it. The tool appears already fitted to its function. What fitted it there is not visible in the record. This pattern competence present at first visibility, long preparation absent from the ground, does not require a dramatic explanation. It may simply reflect the nature of knowledge before external storage existed. A technique carried in a body leaves almost no trace except eventually the object it produced. A tradition maintained in voices and gestures dissolves when the people who held it are gone, and if the line of transmission breaks through climate disruption, demographic collapse, forced migration, or the simple attrition of time, an entire body of accumulated understanding can vanish, while the objects it once produced remain, creating the impression that skill arrived without a source, that sophistication emerged without apprenticeship, that civilization had no childhood at all. What the three traces in this episode follow is not a single missing event. They follow a condition, the condition of knowledge in deep time, where what people knew and what the ground preserved were separated by an enormous and largely invisible distance. Where capacity existed long before the material circumstances that would allow it to leave a permanent record. Where the gap between what was understood and what survived could stretch across centuries without anyone alive, at the time being aware that a gap existed. The first of those traces runs through the stone through tools that precede Göbekli Tepe by hundreds of thousands of years, and through the question that their precision considered carefully will not stop generating. The skill, before the record, pick up a fragment of obsidian and hold it at an angle to the light. The edge, if it has been worked by someone who knew what they were doing, will be continuous and controlled a curve that does not waver, ground down to a thinness that a modern scalpel approaches but rarely exceeds. The material itself is volcanic glass, formed when silica-rich lava cools faster than crystals can grow, and its behavior under pressure is almost paradoxical. It is simultaneously one of the most brittle substances a prehistoric toolmaker could have chosen, and one of the sharpest. A single mistimed strike shatters it. A correctly placed one removes a flake so thin it is nearly translucent. Working obsidian successfully requires not just strength but a precise understanding of force, where to apply it, at what angle, with what tempo, and that understanding cannot be learned quickly. It accumulates across years of practice, refined through failure, transmitted through direct demonstration from someone who already knows to someone who does not yet. What makes obsidian significant to the question this episode is, tracing is not the material itself, but its distribution. Prehistoric toolmakers did not simply use what was nearest. In dozens of documented cases across the ancient Near East, Central Europe and Mesoamerica, finished obsidian tools have been found at sites located 2, 3, sometimes 400 kilometers from the nearest known volcanic source. This means the people who made these tools were not opportunists picking up convenient stone. They were operating within systems of movement of exchange of geographic knowledge that required planning across distances and seasons, reliable knowledge of where specific outcrops were located, and either the capacity to travel those distances themselves or access to networks through which the raw material moved. Either way, the picture is of people embedded in a social and spatial world considerably more organized than the phrase hunter-gatherer is typically allowed to suggest. But the distribution is only one part of the problem. The other part is the quality of the finished objects. Experimental archaeologists, researchers who attempt to replicate prehistoric techniques using only the tools and moors available at the time have spent decades studying the mechanics of stone knapping. And what they consistently report is that achieving the level of precision visible in many prehistoric tools requires not months of practice but years, and that even after years, consistent results at the highest levels of craft are not guaranteed. The Levallois technique developed somewhere around 300,000 years ago and used across an enormous geographic range from Africa through Europe and into Central Asia, involves preparing a stone core in a specific three-dimensional shape before a single usable flake is struck from it. The preparation can require a dozen or more preliminary strikes, each of which must be placed correctly or the core is ruined. The final flake, when it separates, has a predetermined shape, one that the maker visualized before any of the preparatory work began. This is not reactive behavior. It is planning enacted in stone, and it appears in the record already accomplished, already widespread, already consistent across populations separated by geography and time. The consistency is what generates the most persistent questions. Across sites separated by thousands of kilometers, toolmakers working in the same tradition produce objects that a trained eye can identify as belonging to the same family of practice, same angles, same preparatory sequences, same finishing gestures. This regularity implies transmission. Someone showed someone else how to do this. That person showed others. The chain extended across generations and somehow across distances that would have made direct contact infrequent or impossible. The knowledge travelled in some form while remaining recognizable at its destination. How that happened through migration, through periodic contact between groups, through cultural diffusion operating across routes we cannot now fully reconstruct remains a subject of genuine archaeological debate. What is not debated is that it happened. What the record does not show is how long it took for the technique to develop before it became visible to us. This is the central difficulty. Stone tools do not preserve their learning curve. The failed attempts, the broken cores, the pieces discarded at an angle that was slightly off, these exist technically in the archaeological record, but they look like debris rather than evidence of process, and they are rarely studied with the same attention as the successful tools. What we see clearly are the results, objects that when we encounter them are already the product of a mature tradition. The tradition itself, its origins, its early awkward phases, its moments of breakthrough existed before the tools we can study in a period for which our evidence grows progressively thinner the further back we look. There is also the question of what these tools were part of. Stone was never the whole of prehistoric technology. It was the durable component of toolkits that included wood, bone hide fibre and plant resin materials that survive poorly or not at all across deep time. Evidence of hafting adhesives, the compounds used to attach stone points to wooden shafts, has been found on tools dating back more than 70,000 years in some African sites. Making these adhesives required heating specific plant resins or mixing ochre with animal fat and birch pitch in ratios that produce a workable compound, a process that implies not just knowledge of individual materials, but an understanding of how they interact under controlled conditions. The composite tool when finished was a piece of engineered technology. The stone point was only its most legible surviving component. What all of this suggests, the distribution networks, the technical consistency, the invisible adhesive chemistry, the planning encoded in preparatory flaking, is that the people who made these objects were operating within knowledge systems of considerable depth and reach. Systems that took time to build. Systems that required social structures capable of transmitting detailed procedural knowledge across generations and across the distances that separate one obsidian outcrop from the site where its products were eventually found. The tools arrive in the record looking like conclusions, but conclusions require premises, and the premises of prehistoric stone technology stretch back into a span of time that our excavations have so far only partially illuminated. The second trace begins somewhere different, not in the hand of a toolmaker, but in the soil of an early field in the genetic record of a plant that changed shape under sustained human attention, and in the question of what that change required from the people who produced it. The field without a draft. Somewhere in the genetic structure of a modern wheat kernel written in the arrangement of its chromosomes is a record of a relationship that began long before anyone thought to call it agriculture. The kernel is larger than its wild ancestor. Its husk is thinner, easier to process. It does not shatter and disperse at maturity the way wild grasses do, a trait that makes it almost entirely dependent on human hands for reproduction, because a plant that cannot scatter its own seeds cannot survive without someone to collect them, store them, and return them to the ground the following season. These are not minor variations. They represent a fundamental reorganization of the plant's reproductive strategy, one that took hold across multiple generations of selection, and one that bound the plant and the people managing it into a relationship of mutual dependence that neither could easily exit once it had deepened past a certain point. The genetic distance between wild einkorn wheat and its earliest domesticated forms has been studied in considerable detail, and what that distance implies in terms of the number of generations of consistent selective pressure required to produce, it runs into the hundreds. Not dozens, hundreds of growing seasons during which someone or many someones across overlapping generations was paying close enough attention to the harvest to preferentially collect the seeds that expressed the traits they found useful and disciplined enough to replant those seeds rather than consuming them entirely. This is not casual behavior. It is sustained intentional intergenerational management of a plant population conducted without written records, without formal botanical knowledge, and without any guarantee that the investment would produce results within a single human lifetime. The people doing it could not have known, in any explicit sense, that they were domesticating a species. But the cumulative effect of their choices is preserved in the plant's genome, and it tells a story of attention and continuity that stretches back considerably further than the first clear archaeological evidence of farming settlements. The difficulty is that the archaeological record of this process is sparse in ways that do not quite match what the genetic record implies. In the Fertile Crescent, the region in Western Asia where wheat and barley domestication is best documented, the earliest definitively domesticated grain samples appear in the record already exhibiting the full cluster of domestication traits, as though the transition happened rapidly or happened elsewhere and arrived in the sites we have excavated already complete. The intermediate stages, the populations of grain that were partly domesticated, expressing some traits but not others, representing the long middle of the developmental process, are present in the record but patchily, and not always in the geographic sequence that a straightforward model of local gradual development would predict. Something in the developmental story is either missing from the soil, or occurred across a wider geographic range than early models assumed, or unfolded in conditions that have since been buried or eroded or drowned beneath risen sea levels. Maize sharpens the difficulty considerably. Its wild ancestor, a grass called teosinte, native to the river valleys of western Mexico, looks so unlike modern corn that when botanists first proposed the relationship in the early 20th century, the idea was seriously contested. The transformation between teosinte's small hard-cased ear and the large many-rowed cob of domesticated maize required changes across multiple genes, simultaneously changes that under natural selection alone would have been vanishingly unlikely to accumulate in the direction they did. The current consensus is that deliberate human selection drove the transformation, but the time required for that selection to produce what the archaeological record shows is estimated at anywhere from several centuries to several thousand years of sustained management. When maize appears as a staple crop in Mesoamerican sites, it is already integrated into complex agricultural systems already diverse in variety, already associated with the ritual and cosmological frameworks that would accompany it for millennia afterward. The long period during which it was still becoming what it became is present in the record only as an outline. What is easy to overlook in focusing on what is missing is what the record does preserve about the knowledge that preceded formal agriculture and how extensive that knowledge demonstrably was. Hunter-gatherer societies across multiple continents managed their landscapes with a sophistication that only became legible to outside observers relatively recently. Controlled burning, practiced across Australia, North America, and parts of Africa, for thousands of years is not a simple act. It requires understanding how fire moves through different vegetation types at different times of year, which species regenerate vigorously after burning and which do not, how to use landscape features to contain a burn, and how to time the practice relative to animal movement patterns and seasonal rainfall. The ecological knowledge embedded in a successful burning regime is the product of generations of observation, experimentation, and accumulated understanding, none of which required writing to develop, and almost none of which left the kind of durable physical trace that excavation can recover. The same applies to what ethnobotanists have documented among surviving forager and semi-forager populations: detailed knowledge of hundreds of plant species, their seasonal availability, their medicinal properties, their behavior under different soil and rainfall conditions, the ways in which they can be encouraged or discouraged through selective harvesting. This knowledge is not incidental. It is comprehensive enough that researchers studying traditional ecological knowledge have repeatedly found that indigenous botanical classifications and management practices encode information about plant behavior that Western science arrived at independently, sometimes centuries later. The knowledge was always there. It simply lived in people rather than in texts, which means the archaeological record of it is almost entirely indirect, visible only in its effects on pollen profiles, on animal bone assemblages, on the spatial distribution of useful species around long-abandoned campsites. What this suggests about the agricultural transition is something the standard account tends to flatten. The shift from foraging to farming was not a shift from ignorance to knowledge. The knowledge was already present in depth. What changed was the organizational context in which that knowledge was applied, the move from flexible mobile management of a wide range of species to intensive sedentary investment in a narrow range of high-yield crops. That transition carried real costs, including dietary narrowing, increased disease burden, and the social pressures that come with fixed property and surplus production. The question of why people made it and why they made it when they did in multiple regions within a relatively compressed window of time remains genuinely contested, but the knowledge that made it possible was not new. It had been accumulating in perishable form across a span of time that the agricultural record itself does not show. The third trace moves into less material territory, into the domain of what ancient peoples remembered, and what shape that memory took when the things they were remembering had already begun to recede beyond the reach of direct experience. What the stories kept, consider what it would take for a piece of information to survive 10,000 years without being written down. Not a general idea, not a vague cultural mood, but a specific piece of information. The location of a coastline that no longer exists. The description of a landscape that was swallowed by rising water before anyone alive today was born. The memory of a catastrophe so complete that the society it struck did not survive intact enough to leave a material record. For that information to persist across 100 generations of oral transmission, it would need to be embedded in something memorable enough to be repeated accurately, important enough to be treated as worth preserving, and stable enough in its structure to resist the distortions that accumulate in any story retold across centuries. It would need, in other words, to become myth. And myth as a vehicle for information is simultaneously more durable and more treacherous than almost any other form of human communication. Durable because it travels in narrative rather than in fact, and treacherous for exactly the same reason. The convergence of flood narratives across ancient cultures is one of their most frequently cited and most frequently dismissed patterns in comparative mythology. It is cited because the structural similarities are real, a world that existed before the flood, a warning received by a small number of people, survival through specific preparation, a new beginning built on what the survivors carried forward. These elements appear in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, in the Hebrew account of Noah, in the Sanskrit story of Manu, warned by a fish, in Chinese traditions of floods that required generations of labor to manage in indigenous American narratives from cultures separated by thousands of kilometers from any of the others. It is dismissed with roughly equal frequency because structural similarity in narrative is not the same as shared historical origin. Humans facing catastrophic water events in any era will naturally produce stories shaped by the experience of water as destroyer, and the rebuilding narrative follows almost inevitably from the survival premise. the skeptical argument is clean and it carries real weight. What makes it slightly less clean when pressed is the specificity that some of these traditions preserve beneath their symbolic surface. Researchers studying the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australian coastal communities have documented narratives describing the flooding of specific landscapes named places, particular bays and headlands that match with reasonable geographic accuracy. The coastline configurations that existed before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age more than 7,000 years ago in some cases, and more than 10,000 years ago in others. These are not vague accounts of water covering the land. They are stories about particular places that changed, encoded in a narrative form that allowed them to persist across a span of time that exceeds the entire written historical record by a considerable margin. The information is specific enough to be checked against geological data, and in several documented cases it checks out. This does not prove that all flood myths are historical records. It does suggest that oral tradition under the right conditions is capable of preserving specific environmental information across timescales that most scholars would not have considered plausible before this research was conducted. The teacher figures present a different kind of difficulty. Across cultures that had no documented contact with each other, ancient traditions describe the appearance after periods of catastrophe or at the dawn of a new age of beings who arrive, carrying knowledge of agriculture, of law, of astronomical observation, of construction of writing. The Mesopotamian Apkallu. The 7 sages said to have taught humanity the arts of civilization before the Great Flood are perhaps the most elaborately documented. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl arrives associated with calendrical knowledge and the cultivation of maize. In the Andean tradition, Viracocha emerges from a primordial lake and teaches the skills of organized life to a world still finding its shape. In Egypt, Thoth holds the records of all that was known before the present order. The details differ, the structure does not. In each case, the figure is not an inventor but a restorer, someone who brings back what was lost, who reminds rather than creates, whose authority rests on the claim that the knowledge predates the civilization currently receiving it. This framing is the part that generates genuine unease because it can be explained in multiple ways, none of which can be ruled out with available evidence. The rationalist reading is straightforward after any significant disruption. Certain individuals who retained older knowledge, skilled elders, specialists, survivors from more organized communities would naturally become figures of unusual authority in the communities they joined or helped to rebuild. Over generations, those individuals would be remembered as exceptional, then as legendary, then as mythic. The knowledge they carried would be remembered as ancient because from the perspective of the rebuilt community it was ancient, it predated the disruption that reshaped their world. Myth transforms this social reality into narrative by giving the knowledge bearer a supernatural origin. The content is preserved. The historical context is sublimated into symbol. This explanation is coherent, internally consistent, and requires no assumptions beyond what we already know about how oral cultures process significant social change. What it does not fully account for is the geographic range of the pattern and the consistency of the specific claim embedded within it, not just that knowledge was transmitted, but that it was transmitted from somewhere prior, from a world that existed before the present one and was more complete in ways the present world is still trying to recover. That claim appears as if cross-traditions separated by oceans and millennia, expressed in different languages, embedded in different cosmological frameworks, and yet recognizable as the same claim when the surface differences are set aside. It may be a universal feature of human narrative. The instinct to locate authority in the past is deeply rooted across cultures. But it may also be a memory imprecise and refracted through centuries of retelling of something that actually preceded the civilizations that preserved the story. The two possibilities are not easily separated, and the difficulty is precisely what makes this trace the most uncomfortable of the three. What makes the discomfort productive rather than paralyzing is that it connects to the other two traces in a way that is worth examining directly. And that examination is what the next chapter attempts.
3a.
Angles, one shadow. 18,000 years ago, at the height of the last glacial maximum sea levels, sat roughly 120 meters below where they stand today. The continental shelves that are now submerged, the wide, shallow platforms extending from the edges of the land masses we know were exposed land, and in many regions they were among the most hospitable environments available, low-lying temperate rich in coastal and estuarine resources, located at the intersection of marine and terrestrial food systems that together could support dense and relatively stable human populations. These are exactly the kinds of environments where, if the standard model of civilization's development is correct, we would expect to find the early phases of the processes we have been tracing. The tentative experiments with plant management, the gradual elaboration of symbolic systems, the first attempts at the kind of sustained communal organization that leaves eventually a mark in stone. When the ice melted and the water rose, those environments disappeared. Whatever accumulated there went with them into depths that are difficult to excavate and largely unexplored, leaving the inland record to tell a story that may be missing its opening chapters. This is not a fringe conjecture. The submergence of the continental shelves at the end of the last ice ages established geology. The likelihood that human populations were concentrated along those now drowned coastlines is consistent with everything we know about where people tend to live when given a choice. The implication that a significant portion of the developmental record for the skills and systems that appear suddenly in the inland archaeological evidence may simply no longer be accessible is one that a growing number of researchers take seriously, even if it remains difficult to test directly. What it means for the three traces this episode has been following is that each of them may be showing us not the beginning of a process, but a middle phase already well advanced by the time it became visible in the environments where preservation was possible. Place the three traces side by side and the shadow they cast begins to take a shared shape. The stone tools appear in the records already expressing a level of technical maturity that implies a long prior tradition, consistent techniques, standardized form distribution networks, requiring geographic knowledge and social infrastructure that suggest organized movement across landscapes over many generations. The agricultural record shows crops already transformed by sustained selective pressure, and surrounding those crops a body of ecological knowledge so deep and detailed that it could not have been assembled quickly embedded in forager practices of landscape management that predate farming settlements by an unknown but considerable margin. The mythological record preserves across cultures that could not have been in contact a structural memory of prior knowledge of a world that existed before the present. One of teachers who restored rather than invented catastrophic water that erased what came before and the forced a rebuilding from fragments. Three different kinds of evidence from three different domains pointing toward the same underlying condition that what became visible in the archaeological record when it finally appeared was not new. The Natufian culture of the ancient Levant offers a case study in how this condition can be partially glimpsed at the edges of the visible record. The Natufians who occupied parts of what is now the Israel-Jordan, Lebanon and Syria between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago are often described as a transitional culture, semi-sedentary, not yet fully agricultural harvesting. Wild grains intensively with flint-bladed sickles whose use-wear patterns indicate they were processing cereal grasses in quantities large enough to leave a distinct polish on the cutting edge. They built stone structures. They buried their dead with personal ornaments. They maintained cemeteries, fixed locations where the community's relationship with its own dead was formalized and returned to repeatedly, which implies a degree of territorial attachment inconsistent with the fully mobile lifestyle the same period is supposed to represent. And then, around 12,900 years ago, the Younger Dryas began and temperatures across the region dropped sharply, and the Natufian communities that had been experimenting with semi-sedtism contracted back toward more mobile strategies, and the thread of development that had been accumulating snapped, or at least bent severely before it could solidify into what came afterward. What came afterward, once the Younger Dryas ended and temperatures stabilized again around 11,700 years ago, looks in some respects like a resumption rather than a beginning, as though the developmental momentum that had been building before the cold interruption picked up again from somewhere close to where it had left off, only now in slightly different locations among populations that may have carried forward fragments of Natufian practice without carrying the Natufians themselves. This is speculative, and the archaeological evidence for direct continuity is uneven, but the pattern it suggests interrupted accumulation. Partial survival resumption under new conditions aligns with what the three traces individually imply, and gives that implication that the specific documented, partially excavated shape. The shared shadow of the three traces considered together is this: the gap between prehistory and civilization is not adequately described as a gap between ignorance and knowledge, or between incapacity and competence. The competence was present, the knowledge was accumulating. What was missing were the specific material conditions, climatic stability, population density, above a critical threshold, the right configuration of resources and social structures that would allow accumulated knowledge to crystallize into forms durable enough to leave a record. When those conditions finally aligned, the crystallization happened quickly because the underlying material was already prepared. The speed that looks from our vantage like sudden emergence was experienced from within the process as a kind of release, the moment when what had been developing for a long time finally found the conditions it needed to become permanent. This reading has a clarity to it that is in itself a reason to be careful with it. Clean explanations for complex historical problems are often partially right and systematically wrong in ways that only become visible when the explanation is examined from outside its own logic. The next chapter is dedicated to that examination, to the strongest arguments against the picture the three traces have been building, and to what those arguments genuinely account for and what they do not. What the mainstream holds and where it holds less firmly. The most disciplined response to everything the previous chapters have traced is also the simplest one, and it deserves to be stated clearly before it is examined. Preservation bias. The argument runs explains the apparent compression of the prehistoric record, without requiring any appeal to lost knowledge, interrupted accumulation or submerged developmental phases. Stone survives. Bone survives under the right conditions. Almost everything else does not. When we look at the prehistoric record and notice that sophisticated techniques appear without visible apprenticeship, that domesticated crops arrive without legible intermediate stages, that monument construction begins already confident and organized, we are not observing a genuine historical anomaly. We are observing the systematic filtering effect of 10,000 years of decay. The learning curve existed. The failed experiments existed. The tentative early phases of every complex skill and social system existed. They were simply made of materials that time consumed before we arrived to look for them. The record is incomplete not because something extraordinary happened, but because ordinary processes of organic decomposition, erosion, and sediment disruption removed the evidence of ordinary developmental stages. What remains is the durable tail end of processes whose earlier portions are gone, and we mistake that tail end for a beginning because it is all we can see. This argument is serious, and it's not wrong. It is in fact one of the most important correctives available to anyone thinking carefully about deep prehistory, because the temptation to treat absence of evidence as evidence of absence is persistent and genuinely distorting. The wooden tools existed, the fibre baskets existed, the earthen structures and the perishable ritual objects and the carefully maintained oral traditions existed, and almost none of them left anything behind. Any honest account of the prehistoric record has to hold that incompleteness at the front of its thinking, not as a footnote. The mainstream position on this point is correct, and the traces this episode has been following do not depend on denying it. Where the preservation argument becomes less complete is in the specific cases where the record is not simply absent but actively inconsistent with what a straightforward developmental model would predict. The distribution of obsidian tools across distances of 300 and 400 kilometers is not explained by preservation bias. The tools themselves survived, and what they document is a system of movement and exchange that requires social infrastructure. We do not find clearly evidenced in the same period. The genetic signatures of domesticated wheat and maize imply hundreds of generations of sustained selective management, but the archaeological sites where that management should have been most visible, if it occurred in the inland locations the early agricultural record emphasizes, do not consistently show the intermediate stages the genetic timeline requires. These are not gaps created by decay, they are gaps in the pattern itself, and pointing to preservation bias as their explanation requires assuming that the missing evidence existed in exactly the places and forms most vulnerable to loss, which is possible but not demonstrated. The second major counter-argument concerns convergent development, and it is in some respects even more powerful than the preservation case. The fact that multiple civilizations arising independently in different parts of the world produce similar organizational structures, cities, writing, monumental architecture, astronomical observation, formal religion, stratified social hierarchies. does not require a common source. It requires only that human beings, when they reach certain thresholds of population density and resource surplus, tend to arrive at similar solutions to similar problems. Coordination at scale requires administration. Administration requires record-keeping. Record-keeping produces writing. Surplus requires storage and distribution systems. Those systems produce hierarchy. Hierarchy produces monumental expression of authority. The similarities between early Mesopotamian, Chinese, Mesoamerican, and Andean civilizations may reflect not a shared inheritance, but a shared cognitive architecture encountering shared structural challenges under broadly comparable conditions. The wheel, this argument suggests, gets reinvented because wheels work not because someone remembered the first one. This too carries genuine explanatory force, and the episode does not dispute it as a general principle. Human cognitive universals do produce convergent solutions. The question is whether convergent development fully accounts for the specific technical knowledge, the precise astronomical alignments, the standardized measurement systems, the particular forms of symbolic vocabulary that appear early and consistently across regions with no documented contact. Convergence explains why people in different places build monuments. It has more difficulty explaining why those monuments so frequently encode the same celestial cycles with the same degree of precision, or why measurement conventions in ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley, and Mesoamerica show ratios that align more closely than independent invention would be expected to produce. These specific overlaps may have mundane explanations that the available evidence simply does not yet supply, but the mundane explanation has not been supplied, which means the overlap remains a data point without a settled interpretation. The third counterargument addresses the mythological trace directly. Structural similarities in flood narratives and teacher figure traditions across cultures. The skeptical position holds reflect universal features of human narrative psychology rather than shared historical memory. Floods are among the most catastrophic experiences available to any human community, and the story of survival, loss, and rebuilding follows almost inevitably from the experience itself. Teacher figures who restore knowledge after catastrophe are expressions of a universal cultural instinct to locate authority in the past, and to explain the origins of valued knowledge by attributing it to exceptional beings. These are not historical memories. They are narrative archetypes, and their similarity across cultures tells us something about human cognition, not about human history. This argument is difficult to refute cleanly, and in its general form it is almost certainly correct. What it does not account for is the specific geographic precision documented in some Aboriginal Australian traditions, where the named locations described as flooded match post-glacial inundation patterns, with an accuracy that the archetype explanation does not generate. Archetypes produce structural similarity. They do not typically produce accurate coastal geography for landscapes that have been underwater for 7,000 years. Each of these three counter-arguments explain something real. None of them examined carefully against the specific details the traces have surfaced, explains everything the traces describe. The pattern remains open, not confirmed, not refuted, but genuinely and specifically unresolved in ways that the available evidence does not yet close. What remains after the skeptical pressure is applied is not a weakened case, but a more precisely located one, and that precision is where the next chapter begins. The invisible foundation. After the skeptic's pressure has been applied and the genuine explanatory force of each counterargument acknowledged, what remains is not rubble, but a more carefully drawn outline. The preservation argument is correct that most of the developmental record has been lost to decay. The convergent development argument is correct that similar challenges tend to produce similar solutions across independent populations. The narrative archetype argument is correct that structural similarities in myth do not automatically imply historical connection. All three of these positions are right about something real. What they share, however, is a focus on the material and the narrative, on tools, on crops, on stories, while leaving largely unexamined the domain that may matter most to the question. This episode is tracing the social knowledge that made everything else possible, and the question of how long it took to develop and what happened to it when conditions turned severe. Social knowledge is the most invisible category of human achievement. It leaves almost no direct archaeological trace. It cannot be carbon dated. It does not appear in pollen profiles or genetic sequences. It is not encoded in the stratigraphy of an excavation site. And yet without it, none of the material achievements the previous chapters have examined could have occurred. Quarrying and transporting a 16-ton pillar requires not just the physical capacity to move stone, but a social system capable of coordinating the labour of people who are not immediate family. Motivating sustained effort over months or years, resolving the disputes that inevitably arise in any large collective project, and maintaining shared commitment to an outcome whose completion lies beyond the visible horizon of any single participant's daily experience. The engineering problem of moving heavy stone is, in a sense, the easier part. The social problem of getting enough people to agree to do it together, and to keep agreeing across the time required, is the harder one, and it is entirely invisible in the finished structure. What this means for the question of prehistoric complexity is that the absence of monumental architecture writing or large-scale agriculture in a given period tells us very little about the social sophistication of the people living through it. A community that has developed robust mechanisms for conflict resolution, reliable systems for building trust across group boundaries, and effective methods for coordinating collective action without centralized coercion, has achieved something extraordinarily difficult. Something that took modern organizational theorists centuries of institutional development to partially reconstruct in explicit form. And that community may leave behind in the archaeological record nothing more than a scatter of hearths and a few broken tools. The social infrastructure and the material trace are not proportional. They never were. The megalithic complex at Karnak on the southern coast of Brittany in northwestern France offers a partial window into this problem. The site comprises more than 3,000 standing stones arranged in parallel rows, extending across several kilometres of landscape with associated chamber tombs, enclosures, and isolated menhirs that together represent one of the largest concentrations of prehistoric monument construction anywhere in the world. The earliest elements date to around 4,500 BCE, roughly contemporary with or slightly earlier than the first phases at Stonehenge, and predating the construction of the Egyptian pyramids by more than 1,000 years. What is particularly significant about Karnak for the question of social knowledge is not the stones themselves, but what their construction and maintenance implies about the organisational capacity of the people responsible for them. Building 3,000 standing stones across several kilometres of landscape, maintaining their alignment and integrating them into a coherent ritual and astronomical framework over a period of centuries as required a social system capable of coordinating effort across multiple communities, across multiple generations, and across the kind of temporal horizon that most modern institutions struggle to sustain even with written records and formal governance structures. The people who did this had no writing. They had no formal legal system we can document. What they had, evidently, was a social knowledge system sophisticated enough to substitute for all of it. The astronomical dimensions of the Karnak complex deepen the implication. Several researchers have argued that elements of the alignment and code knowledge of the lunar standstill cycle, the 18-6-year period over which the moon's rising and setting positions on the horizon shift through their full range before returning to their starting point. Tracking this cycle accurately enough to encode it in a permanent stone alignment requires sustained observation across at minimum 2 full cycles, preferably more, with records precise enough to distinguish the true extreme from the near extreme positions that bracket it in the years immediately before and after the standstill. That is a minimum of 37 years of careful observation before a single stone can be placed with confidence. More likely the knowledge was accumulated across multiple generations before anyone attempted to fix it in permanent form. The monument is not the beginning of the astronomical knowledge. It is the point at which the knowledge became stable enough to be trusted with stone. This is the pattern that the skeptic chapter's most powerful arguments do not reach. Preservation bias explains the absence of perishable materials. Convergent development explains the independent appearance of similar solutions. Narrative archetypes explain the structural similarities in flood traditions. But none of these arguments explains how the social knowledge necessary to sustain 37 years of coordinated astronomical observation or centuries of monument construction or hundreds of generations of intentional plant management developed in the first place, or how it survived the disruption climatic, demographic, ecological that the same period is known to have produced. The question of how humans learned to cooperate at the scales that civilization required is not answered by pointing to the cooperation's eventual outcomes. It is a prior question, and it reaches back into a period for which the material evidence is exactly as thin and fragmentary as the skeptic argues it is. What remains after the skeptic has said everything true that can be said is a question about social time, about how long it takes for the invisible infrastructure of human cooperation to develop to the point where it can sustain the visible achievements the archaeological record eventually shows. That question does not resolve toward a single answer, but it opens into territory. The next chapter explores territory where the traces begin to converge, not on an explanation, but on a scale. The grammar of measurement. At sites separated by more than 1,000 kilometers across the Indus Valley, from Mohenjo-Daro in what is now southern Pakistan to Harappa, further north from the coastal port of Lothal to the inland city of Dhulavira, excavators working across the 20th century kept encountering the same thing in the rubble of collapsed walls bricks. Not remarkable in themselves, except that when the bricks were measured, they conformed across all of these sites across distances that would take weeks to travel on foot and across a civilization that lasted nearly a millennium to a consistent ratio of 1 to 2 to 4 height to width to length, with a precision that the variation in individual examples does not significantly disturb. No written record of this standard has been found. No manual of construction, no decree establishing the ratio, no administrative document specifying that a brick made in Lothal should match one made in Harappa. The standard existed evidently because the people who made the bricks understood it, carried it as a shared convention, transmitted it through training and practice, and maintained it across a geographical and temporal span that makes the consistency more striking the longer it is considered. Standardized measurement is not a trivial achievement. It requires at minimum agreement, a shared understanding that a specific unit means the same thing to the person using it in one location as it does to the person using it in another, and that this equivalence will hold not just between two individuals in direct contact, but across the full range of people who participate in the system. Maintaining that equivalence without writing requires either continuous direct contact between all participants, which is logistically impossible at civilizational scale, or a transmission system reliable enough to carry the standard accurately from teacher to student across generations without the kind of drift that accumulates in any game of telephone played across sufficient iterations. The Indus brick ratio survived both the distance and the time. Whatever transmission system carried it was working. What that system looked like and how long it took to develop the reliability it clearly possessed, the archaeological record does not show. The Egyptian royal cubit divided into 7 palms, each palm into 4 fingers, the whole unit standardized across the Old Kingdom with enough precision that master cubits made of granite were kept in temples and used to calibrate the working cubits distributed to construction sites, shows a similar pattern of operational sophistication without a visible developmental phase. The cubit itself almost certainly predates its formal standardization. The body-based logic of the unit, derived from the distance between the elbow and the tip of the middle finger, is ancient and cross-cultural, appearing in various forms across the ancient world. But the formalization, the decision to fix the unit in granite to distribute calibration standards, to build administrative infrastructure around measurement consistency, implies a society that already understood from prior experience what happens when measurement standards drift, and why preventing that drift matters enough to invest institutional resources in maintaining it. The solution presupposes familiarity with the problem, and familiarity with the problem of measurement drift at civilizational scale is not something that emerges from a single generation of building experience. The question this raises, when placed alongside the stone tool distribution networks and the intergenerational management of domesticated crops, is whether what we are looking at in each of these cases is a different manifestation of the same underlying capacity, the ability to maintain a standard across time and space without external recording systems, a technique for knapping obsidian to a specific edge geometry, a practice of selecting grain seeds for specific heritable traits, a brick ratio that holds across 1,000 kilometers of construction. Each of these requires a transmission system capable of carrying precise information across generations without significant degradation. Each of them represents a form of standardization not imposed from above by written decree, but maintained from within by communities who understood what the standard was and why it mattered. The sophistication required for this kind of distributed, unwritten standardization is not small, and it is almost entirely invisible in the archaeological record, except as an outcome. Alexander Thom, a Scottish engineer who spent decades measuring megalithic sites across Britain and Brittany, in the mid-20th century, proposed that a consistent unit of approximately 829 metres, which he called the megalithic yard, appeared repeatedly in the layout dimensions of stone circles and alignments across the region. His statistical analysis suggested that the unit was too consistent across too many sites to be accidental, implying either a shared measurement standard maintained across the communities responsible for these structures, or a common mathematical convention that produced the same effective unit independently at multiple locations. Tom's hypothesis has been contested, refined, and partially supported by subsequent researchers with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and the debate around it has not fully resolved. But the debate itself is instructive that the question of whether prehistoric monument builders in northwestern Europe were working with a shared measurement standard is considered a serious archaeological question rather than a fringe speculation, because the alternative that the statistical regularities Tom documented are coincidental requires an explanation of its own. What expands when these cases are placed beside each other is not the mystery, but the scope of it. The question is no longer specifically about stone tools or about agriculture, or about mythological memory, or about any single domain of prehistoric achievement. It is about a capacity that seems to run beneath all of them, the capacity to maintain precision across time, to transmit knowledge without external storage, to hold a standard in common across populations that were not in continuous direct contact. This capacity is the invisible infrastructure beneath the visible record, and it is what the three traces, the Karnaku alignments and the Indus brick ratio, are all in different ways pointing toward. Not a lost technology, not a vanished empire, a lost transmission system, the social and cognitive machinery by which human communities held on to what they knew across the spans of time and disruption that deep prehistory regularly imposed on them. The next chapter examines what happens when that transmission system encounters a specific pattern of detail, of a cluster of observations from different disciplines that, taken individually, each have available explanations, but taken together resist any single framework that fully accounts for all of them at once. The cluster that has no single name. On the morning of the winter solstice in 1967, an archaeologist named Michael O'Kelly lay alone on the stone floor of the inner chamber at Newgrange, in the Boyne Valley of Ireland, and waited. The passage tomb had been known for centuries, a massive circular mound of earth and quartz, dated now to approximately 3200 BCE. Older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids at Giza, built by people whose names and language and specific beliefs have left no record. What O'Kelly was waiting for was something local tradition had preserved as a rumour, a story that at a specific moment in winter, the chamber received light. Above the main entrance set into the facade at precise height was a narrow horizontal aperture, a roof box as it came to be called, whose function had not been understood. O'Kelly lay in the dark and watched it. At the moment of sunrise on the solstice, a shaft of light entered through that aperture, traveled 19 metres down the stone passage without touching the walls, and illuminated the floor of the inner chamber and the spiral carvings on its back wall. It lasted 17 minutes. Then the sun moved and the chamber returned to darkness for another year. The precision required to produce this effect is not approximate. The roof box is positioned and dimensioned so that the solstice sunrise light entering at its specific azimuth and altitude clears the entrance lintel and travels the full length of the passage to reach the chamber, and does so only at the solstice, not at the days immediately before or after, when the sun's position on the horizon differs by enough to redirect the light or block it entirely. Achieving this required the builders to know, before the first stone of the passage was laid, exactly where the solstice sunrise would appear on the horizon, and exactly what angle the incoming light would make with the ground, and exactly how to orient a 19-metre stone corridor so that its geometry would serve as a lens for a 17-minute annual event. The engineering is precise enough that the effect still works 5,000 years later without adjustment. The passage has not shifted. The calculation was correct. What makes Newgrange significant to the question this episode has been building toward is not the achievement in isolation. Individual examples of astronomical precision in ancient construction can be, and regularly are, explained by long observation, by the accumulation of knowledge across multiple generations of skywatching, conducted from a fixed location by the practical ability of skilled builders to translate angular measurements into stone geometry, without formal mathematics. These are reasonable explanations, and they are probably substantially correct. What becomes harder to sustain as a complete account is the pattern that Newgrange belongs to a global distribution of structures built across different cultures and millennia that encode specific astronomical knowledge with a degree of precision that each instance can partially explain, but that the full distribution resists explaining through independent convergence alone. The granite chambers beneath the pyramid complex at Saqqara, known as the Serapeum, present a different category of the same problem. The Serapeum contains a series of massive granite boxes, each weighing in excess of 70 tons, with interior surfaces finished to tolerances that modern machinists, when first presented with measurements of the finished stone, have described as consistent with precision. Grinding surfaces flat to within fractions of a millimetre, corners squared to a degree of accuracy that requires not just skill, but a reference standard precise enough to check against. These boxes were used according to the conventional account for the burial of the sacred Apis bulls, an important ritual function, but one that does not obviously require the interior surfaces of the burial container to be finished to the tolerances of a precision instrument. The precision is present. The reason the precision was considered necessary for this purpose is not documented anywhere in the surviving record. What is documented is the precision itself, measurable and replicable by anyone with the right instrument, sitting in the dark of a subterranean gallery in the Egyptian desert, outlasting every explanation for why it was achieved. Researchers studying the acoustic properties of megalithic stone chambers, a field that has developed substantially in the past 3 decades, have documented a pattern that extends across passage tombs and chambered cairns from Ireland through Britain and into continental Europe. When sound is introduced into these chambers, particularly sustained tonal sound in specific frequency ranges, many of them produce standing wave resonance effects. The sound reflects and reinforces itself in ways that amplify certain frequencies and create measurable acoustic phenomena that would have been dramatically perceptible to anyone present in the chamber. The frequency ranges involved are not random. They cluster in a band that has specific effects on human auditory perception, and some researchers argue on neurological states associated with trance or altered awareness. Whether the builders understood this in formal acoustic terms is unknowable. Whether they experienced it and found it significant enough to shape their construction choices around it to select chamber dimensions that produce the effect to position the structure so that specific ritual activities would occur in the resonant zone is a question the chambers themselves do not answer, but continue to generate. What the cluster of Newgrange, the Serapeum, and the acoustic chambers share is not a single explanation, but a single quality. Each of them demonstrates a level of deliberate precision that exceeds what the documented purpose of the structure requires, applied in a domain astronomical alignment, surface geometry, acoustic resonance, where precision produces effects that are experiential rather than simply functional. You do not need the Newgrange solstice effect to use the chamber for burial. You do not need interior surfaces finished to sub-millimeter tolerances to enter a bull. You do not need chambered acoustics to conduct a ritual that could be conducted in the open air. In each case, someone chose the harder path, the more precise option, the solution that required more knowledge and more effort than the stated function demanded. And in each case, what that extra precision produces is an experience of light of material perfection of sound that does not preserve in the archaeological record the way stone does, and therefore leaves no legible trace of why it was considered worth the effort. Not proof, a pattern. And the pattern points not toward a single lost civilization or a singular vanished technology, but toward a relationship between ancient builders and the physical world that was more deliberate, more calibrated, and more concerned with producing specific effects on human perception than the standard account of prehistoric capability has tended to assume. After this chapter, the observation does not build further. It begins instead to settle to find its place in a wider view that the next chapter tries to hold all at once. The landscape, not the evidence, step back far enough from any complex terrain, and the individual features that seem most significant up close begin to lose their separateness. The ridge that dominated the view from within the valley becomes one fold among many. The river that felt like a boundary turns out to be a crease in a larger surface. What appeared at close range to be a collection of distinct and unrelated formations reveals itself from sufficient distance to be a single landscape with its own internal logic, a logic that was always present but invisible until the perspective shifted far enough to allow the whole to be seen at once. This is not a metaphor for the evidence this episode has been examining. It is a description of what happens when you stop treating the evidence as individual arguments to be won or lost and begin reading it instead as a terrain to be understood. The stone tools, the agricultural record, the mythological memory, the astronomical alignments, the measurement standards, the acoustic chambers, the precision finishes of the Serapeum. These are not separate mysteries competing for the same explanatory budget. They are features of a single landscape distributed across deep time, each of them expressing some aspect of the same underlying condition that human cognitive and social capacity developed its full depth long before the material conditions existed that would allow that depth to leave a durable mark. What the landscape shows when read from distance is not a single lost civilization buried beneath the surface, but something simultaneously more ordinary and more difficult to hold in mind. A species spending the vast majority of its existence developing capabilities that its material record consistently underrepresents, interrupted repeatedly by disruptions that erased the most perishable evidence, and finally arriving under the specific conditions of Holocene stability at a threshold where what had been accumulating in bodies and voices could at last be fixed in stone and clay and grain. The threshold model the idea that civilization emerged not from a gradual linear progression, but from the crossing of several interlocking tipping points that once crossed produced rapid cascading changes, has gained considerable support in recent decades among researchers in complex systems, evolutionary biology and social archaeology. What makes it useful for reading the landscape this episode has assembled is that it does not require the developmental history to be visible. It only requires that the developmental history occurred in whatever form and in whatever locations the evidence is not preserved, and that what the threshold crossing produced was a rapid release of capabilities that had been building without adequate conditions for expression. A compressed spring does not show its compression in its resting state. Only the release reveals how long the pressure had been accumulating. The Natufian communities, the obsidian distribution networks, the Karnak alignments, the New Grange roof box, the Indus brick ratio, each of these is a place where some portion of the accumulated pressure became briefly visible, where the perishable tradition left a mark durable enough to survive. They are not anomalies in the prehistoric record. They are the record's clearest moments. The places where what was normally carried in practice and voice found for one reason or another, expression in stone or bone or the genetic architecture of a domesticated plant. What surrounds them, the long stretches of the timeline where the record is thinner, where the sophistication implied by the clear moments is not continuously visible, is not absence of development. It is development in the forms that time does not preserve. Reading the landscape from distance also changes the relationship between the three skeptic arguments examined in Chapter 6 and the traces they were applied to. From close range, the arguments seem to contest the traces, to offer alternative explanations that, if accepted, would dissolve the pattern the traces describe. From distance, the relationship looks different. Preservation bias, convergent development, and narrative archetypes are not explanations that contradict the landscape. They are features of the landscape itself. They describe the mechanisms by which the developmental record was filtered, how the visible evidence came to look the way it does. Why independent populations following similar cognitive pathways arrived at structurally similar solutions. They explain the shape of the surviving record without fully accounting for what the record is the surviving tale of. The skeptic arguments and the traces are not opponents. They are different perspectives on the same terrain, each illuminating what the other alone cannot reach. What the distance view adds most significantly is a sense of the temporal scale that individual chapters of evidence tend to obscure. 300,000 years of modern human cognition. 2 million years approximately since the Homo lineage began producing stone tools with the kind of intentional form that implies planning beyond the immediate moment. The period of climatic stability within which everything the archaeological record describes as civilization occurred is 12,000 years old, which is to say it is 4% of the span during which anatomically modern humans have existed, and less than 1% of the span during which the Homo lineage has been making deliberately shaped tools. Civilization on this scale is not the culmination of a long development. It is a recent experiment conducted under unusually favourable conditions, producing outcomes that the preceding developmental history made possible but did not guarantee. The long corridor of prehistory was not a waiting room. It was the main event, the period during which the cognitive and social architecture that civilization would eventually express was built, maintained, disrupted, partially lost, partially recovered, and gradually deepened across a span of time that makes all of recorded history look like a brief and intense afterword. What the landscape shows when held at sufficient distance is that the question this episode began with, why civilization appeared so quickly, so completely without a legible childhood, is perhaps best answered not by looking for what was hidden, but by reconsidering what we mean by preparation. The preparation was not hidden. It was visible all along in every precisely shaped tool, every managed landscape, every flood story that remembered a world before the water rose. We simply trained ourselves to look for preparation in the forms that civilization produces, and missed it entirely in the forms that preceded civilization, because those forms do not announce themselves in the language we learnt to read first. The landscape does not resolve into an answer. It settles into a different quality of question, one less concerned with what was lost, and more concerned with what it means that so much accumulated so deeply before any of it could be written down. That question is where the next chapter begins its descent. The long transmission. There is a particular quality of attention that develops only through sustained practice in a single domain, the kind of attention that a master craftsman brings to material or a skilled navigator brings to the behavior of water and wind, or an experienced farmer brings to the particular way a field holds moisture after rain. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is simply a depth of familiarity with a specific slice of the world so thorough that information becomes available to it that is invisible to less practiced perception, the slight variation in the colour of a stone that indicates how it will fracture, the barely perceptible change in wave pattern that signals a current beneath the surface, the quality of soil that tells an experienced hand whether the ground will hold seeds through a dry season. This kind of attention is not intelligence in the abstract. It is intelligence applied and refined across time until it becomes something closer to perception itself, until the knowledge is no longer something the person has, but something the person is carried in the body rather than held in the mind, transmitted not through instruction, but through proximity and repetition, and the long accumulation of shared practice. What prehistory was in one of its most important dimensions was the development of this kind of attention across every domain that mattered to survival and meaning, across stone and plant and animal, and sky and water, and the intricate social fabric of communities living in close dependence on each other, and on landscapes they knew, with an intimacy that sedentary life tends gradually to erode. 300,000 years of that attention deepening and narrowing and broadening again, as conditions shifted, as populations moved and contracted and expanded, as the climate swung through its long oscillations, and the coastlines rose and fell and rose again. 300,000 years of people paying attention to the world and teaching what they noticed to the people who would outlive them, and receiving in turn what those people had noticed before. The transmission was not always clean. It broke in places, thinned, in others arrived at its destination changed by the passage, but it continued. It continued because the alternative, stopping, forgetting, entirely releasing the accumulated weight of what preceding generations had learned, was never a real option for communities whose survival depended on the knowledge they carried. When civilization arrived, it did not interrupt this transmission. It changed its medium. What had moved through bodies and voices began gradually to move through clay and stone and ink. What had been held in the living continuity of communities began to be held in archives that could survive the communities themselves. This was an enormous transformation, and its consequences were real and lasting. It made certain kinds of knowledge far more durable, far more reproducible, far more resistant to the disruptions that had periodically thinned the oral transmission almost to breaking. But it also changed the knowledge in the process of fixing it. What is written is selected, chosen from the full range of what a community knows for the specific purposes of whoever is doing the writing, shaped by the administrative and ritual priorities of the institutions that maintain the writing system, preserved in the forms that the available materials allow. The vast remainder of what any community knows at any moment is still carried in bodies and practice, and the kind of attention that cannot be transcribed. Writing captures a fraction. The rest continues in the old medium alongside the new one largely invisible to the historical record that the writing eventually creates. This is why the gap between prehistory and civilization, when examined from the inside rather than from the outside from the perspective of people living through it, rather than scholars looking back at it, was probably not experienced as a gap at all. The people who built the first cities were not aware that they were doing something unprecedented. They were doing what their knowledge and their circumstances in combination suggested should be done. The knowledge felt old to them because it was old accumulated across generations they could not fully remember, attributed to ancestors or teachers or divine figures whose historical reality had long since dissolved into the stories told about them. The cities felt like inheritance, not invention, because in the most important sense they were. What was new was not the knowledge that made them possible, but the set of conditions, the climatic stability, the population density, the specific configuration of resources that finally allowed the knowledge to find permanent expression. Held at this angle, the question the episode began with transforms into something quieter. Not why did civilization appear suddenly, but rather what does it mean that the largest portion of human achievement, 300,000 years of developed attention, refined skill accumulated, understanding exists in a form that history cannot adequately record? What does it mean that the most fundamental capacities of human social and cognitive life were developed not in the presence of archives and institutions, but in their complete absence, carried only in the fragile and irreplaceable medium of living human communities? And what does it mean following from this, that every time a community has lost to disease, to displacement, to the slow erosion of context that turns a living tradition into a museum exhibit, something of that long transmission goes with it, not dramatically, not in a way that makes headlines, but permanently, in ways that no archive can fully recover, because the archive was never where it lived. These are not not questions that point toward a conclusion. They point toward a posture, a way of holding the human past that is neither romantically reverential nor dismissively rational, but simply attentive to the scale of what was always happening beneath the visible surface of historical events. The people who napped obsidian to a controlled edge and carried it 300 kilometers to where it was needed were not primitive. The people who spent hundreds of generations selecting seeds for traits they could observe but not explain were not simple. The people who lay in the dark of a stone chamber on the winter solstice morning and watched a shaft of light travel 19 meters to illuminate spiral carvings on a back wall, who built the chamber so that this would happen, who understood without any of the conceptual vocabulary we would use to describe it exactly where the sun would be and exactly what the geometry required, were not by any meaningful measure less than the people who later wrote about the sun in the language of astronomy and theology and myth. We will not resolve this tonight. That is not what this space is for. What it is for is holding the question open long enough that it stops feeling like a problem and begins to feel like a horizon, something that recedes as you approach it, not because it is retreating, but because the closer you get, the more of it there is to see. The last chapter holds a single image, one object, one place, one moment. Let it carry what the words have been reaching toward. The fox in the stone, somewhere in the basement storage of a museum, or in the climate-controlled archive of a university, or still in situ beneath the soil of a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, there is a carved relief of a fox. It is not large. The animal is rendered in low relief against the surface of a T-shaped pillar, one image among many on a structure that is itself one enclosure among several at a site that is itself one layer of a much older and more complex relationship between human beings and this particular hillside. The fox is mid-stride. Its body is turned slightly the way a fox moves when it is aware of being watched, but has not yet decided whether the watcher constitutes a threat. The carving is not crude. The line of the animal's back carries a specific tension, the suggestion of contained movement that required the carver to understand not just the anatomy of a fox, but the particular quality of a fox's attention, the alertness that is always present in it, the readiness that never quite resolves into stillness, even when the animal is standing still. Someone made this. Someone stood at this stone in a light we cannot reconstruct, a morning light perhaps, or the diffuse light of an overcast afternoon, or firelight which would have given the relief a different kind of life, the shadow deepening as the flame moved and worked the limestone with a stone tool until the fox appeared. That person had almost certainly seen many foxes, had watched them move through the landscape that surrounded this ridge, had noted the particular quality of their gait, had carried some image of foxness in their mind, precise enough to be translated into stone with the confidence the carving displays. The carving is not tentative. It was made by someone who knew what they were making and had made things like it before, who belonged to a tradition of image making. Sophisticated enough to have developed a shared visual vocabulary. A set of conventions about how an animal rendered in stone should relate to the surface it inhabits and the space it implies around itself. That person is gone. Their name is gone. The language they spoke is gone so completely that we do not even have fragments of it. No loan words preserved in a later tongue, no place names that might carry its phonemes forward into a period of documentation, nothing. The specific beliefs that made the carving of a fox on a T-shaped pillar a meaningful act rather than simply a decorative one or a habitual one, or any of the other categories we might reach for, are gone. What the fox meant to the person who carved it, what it was meant to communicate or invoke or remember, what relationship it encoded between the community that built this enclosure and the animal whose image they chose to fix permanently in stone, all of this is gone and gone in a way that is not temporary. It is not waiting to be recovered by a more sophisticated analytical technique or a luckier excavation. The meaning lived in people, and the people are gone, and the meaning went with them. What remains is the fox, mid-stride, alert, carrying in the line of its carved back a quality of attention that the person who made it understood well enough to render, and that we 12,000 years later can still recognize because foxes still move that way. And the part of human perception that reads animal movement and finds meaning in it is old enough to have been present in both the carver and in us, continuous across the entire interval that separates us. The fox is a small fact. It sits in the record and will not be explained away, not because it proves anything about lost civilizations or interrupted transmissions or the depth of prehistoric knowledge, but because it is there. Because someone made it, because the making of it required everything. This episode has been tracing the social structure to support a gathering, the technical tradition to shape stone, to precision the symbolic system, to choose this image rather than another, the astronomical and architectural knowledge to orient the enclosure in which the pillar stands, and because none of that context survived except in the shape of the mark itself. Hold that for a moment if you are still with it. Not as an argument, not as evidence for a position, simply as a fact about time and what it does. 12,000 years ago, someone stood at a stone and carved a fox, and the fox is still there, and everything else about that moment, the light, the sound, the meaning, the name of the person holding the tool is gone so completely that we cannot even be certain what questions to ask about it. The gap between what we can see and what we cannot see is not a failure of archaeology. It is a condition of human existence. Most of what people know at any moment in history is not written down, not preserved, not transmitted forward in any form that later periods can recover. It is carried in the living and released when the living are gone, and the world continues without it, not diminished in any way. The world itself registers simply change the way a landscape changes when a species leaves it quietly over time, the absence only visible to those who know what to look for. What this episode has been trying to hold open is not a mystery with a solution waiting somewhere in there as yet unexcavated ground. It is an invitation to sit with a specific quality of not knowing, the not knowing that comes not from insufficient evidence, but from the nature of what the evidence is evidence of. The long human past is not a puzzle whose missing pieces will eventually be found. It is a vast and largely irrecoverable depth of lived experience, of developed attention and accumulated practice and broken transmission and partial recovery of knowledge that was real and effective and sophisticated and almost entirely perishable. The civilization we inhabit is not the culmination of that depth. It is a recent and somewhat unusual expression of it, the phase in which some of what had been accumulating in bodies and voices finally found forms durable enough to outlast the people who held it. The fox in the stone outlasted its maker by 12,000 years. What the maker knew outlasted nothing or very little carried forward in fragments through lineages we cannot trace, arriving at the present in forms so transformed by the passage that the connection is no longer visible. This is not tragic exactly. It is simply the condition of knowledge before external storage, and the condition of knowledge after external storage, and the condition of knowledge in general, always exceeding what any medium can hold, always running ahead of the archive, always being partially lost and partially recovered in the endless process of transmission. That is what culture is at its most basic level, when you strip us away the monuments and the texts and the institutions and look at what is actually happening between one generation and the next. Let the fox be the last image of tonight, mid-stride on a limestone pillar, alert to something just outside the frame, made by hands that understood it in a light that is gone for reasons that went with the people who knew them. Still there, still carrying in the line of its carved back the specific quality of attention that connected a human being to a fox on a hillside in southeastern Turkey 12,000 years ago, and connects across that impossible distance to anyone who looks at it now and recognizes what the carver saw. The question this episode traced does not close. It simply grows quieter the way questions do when they have been held long enough to stop feeling urgent and begin to feel like the shape of something permanent, not a problem to be solved, but a fact to be lived with, like the fact of deep time itself, which surrounds every moment of human experience whether we attend to it or not. Rest now, traveller. The limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey is quiet tonight. It has been quiet for 12,000 years. Give or take the decades of excavation that have slowly returned its buried geometry to like the circular enclosures, the T-shaped pillars, the carved surfaces that hold still the animals someone found worth remembering in stone. The fox is there, the ridge is there. The question of what chapter of human experience had to exist in order to produce. The carving remains exactly where this episode left it, not answered, not dissolved. Simply present the way certain questions are present, once you have looked at them long enough quietly, without demanding resolution occupying a permanent place in the peripheral vision of everything else you know. You do not need to have arrived anywhere tonight. The traces this episode followed through the stone tools and the agricultural record, and the mythological memory, and the astronomical alignments and the measurement standards and the acoustic chambers, and the fox rendered mid-stride on a pillar. Older than anything we typically call history, these were not arguments building toward a verdict. They were observations laid alongside each other, allowed to suggest a shape without being forced into one. This shape they suggest is not a conclusion. It is a kind of depth, the depth of human time which exceeds our ability to fully inhabit it imaginatively, and which continues behind every moment of recorded history as a vast and largely irrecoverable substrate of lived experience that made the recorded part possible. It is enough to have held that depth briefly. It does not require understanding. The things that happened in the long interval between the first precisely made stone tool and the first city were real, whether or not we can recover them effective, whether or not we can name them significant to the people who lived them, whether or not any archive preserved their significance. The gap in our knowledge is not a gap in what happened. Something was always happening. People were always paying attention, always teaching, always carrying forward what the previous generation had worked to understand, that the carrying was imperfect, though the losses were real, and sometimes catastrophic, that the thread thinned almost to breaking in places and broke entirely in others. None of this diminishes what was transmitted. It only makes the survival of anything more striking. The fox survived, in whatever reduced and contextless forms, stripped of the meaning that animated it, separated from the tradition that had produced it legible now only as craft and not as communication. The carved line of its back is still there, still holding the specific quality of attention that connected a human hand to a moving animal on a hillside in the ancient Near East. That survival is not proof of anything beyond itself, it is simply what remained when everything else dissolved. And perhaps that is sufficient not as an answer, but as a kind of company in the not knowing. Something made, something enduring, the maker gone, the meaning gone, the marks still carrying across an interval that dwarfs all of recorded history, the faint warmth of a moment of attention that was real. There may be other foxes in other stones in places the water has not returned to us yet, other marks made by hands that understood what they were making in traditions we cannot now reconstruct for reasons that went with the people who knew them. The thought is not melancholy exactly. It is simply large enough to rest inside if you allow it to be large rather than pressing it toward a smaller shape that fits more comfortably. Let the question stay large tonight. Let it be the size it actually is, the size of 300,000 years of coastlines underwater, of knowledge carried in bodies that are long returned to soil. You do not need to hold all of it. You only needed to have looked in its direction for a little while, which you have done. The ridge is quiet. The fox is mid-stride in the dark of the stone, somewhere between what was known and what was kept, between what the ground preserved and what the living carried, between the first mark made with deliberate attention and the last transmission of something that could no longer find a new recipient in that space which is most of human history, something persists that we do not yet have the right instruments to measure. Sleep now, traveller. The questions will be here when you return to them. They are patient in the way that only very old things learn to be patient, having already outlasted everything that once seemed more urgent than they were.